This is the second session today on civility and democracy. This particular panel is going to approach the issues and the questions of civility and democracy from the framework of religion and religious studies. We have a number of disciplinary perspectives represented up here, and we'll just talk about these issues from those perspectives. My name is Matt Sutton. I'm an associate professor of history at WSU, and we very much appreciate you all coming out for this. So with that, we'll just jump right in. Our first presenter is going to be Paul Boyer. Paul Boyer is Merle Curdy Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's written many books. Among them are When Time Shall Be No More, Prophecy, Belief, in Modern American Culture, which is a wonderful book that's influencing my thinking on my own research, which is part of why I was so glad to have him here. And he also wrote the classic book, Salem Possessed, The Social Origins of Witchcraft, which is a book that's still at the core of American textbook surveys of how we understand the Puritan witchcraft crisis of the 17th century. And finally, he's the editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of American History, which is going to be 12 volumes and is coming out soon or not so soon?
Time will tell.
Time will tell, okay. So, Professor Boyer.
Thanks very much, and thanks to WSU and to the National Endowment for the Humanities and other groups who've brought together this wonderful event. I am from Madison, and Madison has been mentioned several times already. I won't go into my views on that here, but be glad to chat with anybody, including some of my experiences marching the past few weeks. Religion and our topic is a tough topic to approach. As I was trying to think about religion and civility in the context of American history, it seems to me you can almost balance examples on both sides. You have Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was the daughter of an evangelical minister and the sister of 4 other evangelical preachers, who's the great figure in the anti-slavery movement with her great novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. On the other hand, you have in the antebellum period Protestant ministers in New York City who took advantage of a rather apparently feeble-minded woman named Maria Monk, who published, and they published her account of terrible goings-on at a Roman Catholic convent in Montreal. Maria Monk's awful disclosures that contributed to anti-Catholic sentiment in the antebellum period. In more recent times, we had the progressive era when liberal Protestant ministers played a very important role in awakening America to injustice in the workplace and in immigrant cities. And on the other hand, we had the Ku Klux Klan, which Lisa McGurr mentioned, whose very symbol was the cross, the Christian cross, and the burning of the cross. And I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, and crosses were burned in the 1920s, a little before my time, at the University of Dayton, a Catholic institution. And indeed, my grandfather, who had founded and was pastor of a small evangelical mission in Dayton, sadly had to expel his Sunday school superintendent in 1925 for joining the Ku Klux Klan. So the historical record is mixed, and we may get further into that in our discussion, but I would like to focus my comments here on the more recent period. The history panel, which I really enjoyed and I think agreed with, so we had 5 historians maybe who were in agreement, which would be even more unusual, but it did tend to trail off around 1970 with discussions of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movements. It seems to me we're today in a very, in some ways, a very different political and cultural moment from that earlier period. And the question I would focus on would be, what is the role of religion today in this civil discourse problem? But once again, I come up with, sort of yes, but kind of answers. On the one hand, so-called mainstream Protestant denominations, and that's the area of American religion that I work in more closely, certainly are promoting civil discourse and promoting all of the good things that we've been talking about here so far today, working to break down the barriers of religion or class or race that still divide American society. But Protestantism's kaleidoscopic diversity also includes a subset of evangelicals of a particularly fundamentalist caste whose role in the civility debate is considerably more problematic. Understanding the Bible as the literal and inerrant Word of God, these folks see an absolute chasm dividing all humanity. On the one side are the saved who have accepted Jesus Christ as their personal Savior and will live eternally with Christ in heaven. On the other side are the unsaved, those who have rejected Christ and are thus doomed to eternal punishment. And this cosmic divide transcends race, class, political ideology, or national identity, the categories that are often seen as the major barriers to civil discourse. Now, I'm not suggesting that this worldview necessarily leads to personal incivility. Fundamentalist believers can maintain perfectly amicable relations with neighbors, work associates, and others whom they encounter in everyday life. They may engage in respectful discourse at a citizens forum, for example, over whether a new subdivision should be incorporated. Further, as Robert Putnam and his collaborators suggest in their new book, American Grace, many fundamentalists have family members and other relatives who do not share their beliefs. With Putnam's knack for phrase-making, he calls this the Aunt Susan syndrome. The dynamic of personal interaction with relatives and friends no doubt helps dilute the fundamentalist's absolute worldview, but perhaps less so than Putnam optimistically believes. A former close friend of mine has broken off all relations because he believes that I have betrayed the fundamentalist beliefs of our common boyhood and that I am literally damned. I have cousins with whom I can have perfectly friendly conversations, reminiscing about our childhood or talking about neutral matters, but at a certain point, it's very clear that they view me as an object of concern because of our differing religious positions. When we move beyond personal relations to the realm of society and the world at large, the fundamentalist perspective increasingly takes over, rigidly controlling the believer's outlook on a wide range of social, political, and cultural issues and how they should be approached. If one views such issues as affecting one's salvation and eternal destiny, then they are not subject to debate or compromise. Finding common ground is not the point. The theme that's been reiterated here last night and again today, that is simply irrelevant to a fundamentalist religious perspective. These issues are surface manifestations of an absolute division in the nature and natural and spiritual order ordained by God and set forth in infallible Scripture. Some of my own recent work, as was mentioned, has focused on Bible prophecy belief. And this belief system very much reinforces the fundamentalist worldview that I just described. Now, the sacred texts of all great religions are notorious for the many uses to which they can be put. And while when we think of the Christian Bible, which incorporates Hebrew scriptures as well, certainly one can find messages of love and peace and justice and so on. But it's also possible by a selective reading of the sacred scriptures to come up with a very different message. And this is what Bible prophecy popularizers have done very effectively in recent years in American culture. Assembling carefully selected prophetic and apocalyptic passages, they discover, embedded in Scripture, a worldview that divides all reality into righteous and evil forces, with righteousness ultimately triumphant and evil destroyed. Nor is this simply a metaphorical assertion that goodness will ultimately prevail, but a literal, lurid scenario, particularly elaborated in the book of Revelation, foretelling Christ's return as a God of war, when he and the saints will defeat the Antichrist and slaughter his millions of followers at the Battle of Armageddon. Now, prophecy popularizers offer extremely precise narratives of the end-time events that they see leading to the final apocalyptic crisis of human history. So there are real-world implications. Islam is seen as, quote, a religion conceived in the pit of hell, as one prophecy writer recently put it. Many view Barack Obama as preparing the way for the Antichrist, if not the evil one himself. Ecumenical movements, advocates of interreligious dialogue, are in fact seen as dangerous and in fact a prelude to the Antichrist's demonic world religion that will be established in the future. From this perspective, a Middle Eastern peace settlement involving a two-state solution and joint governance of Jerusalem, the official position of the U.S. State Department, would directly challenge God's plan for the region in which the Jewish state will vastly expand and a rebuilt Jerusalem temple will be the site of Christ's millennial kingdom. Now, such theological derived views are not amenable to reasoned discourse. They're not matters of compromise. These are matters of ultimate truth. In the give and take of mutually respectful debate and the things we've been talking about as desirable goals for our civic culture and our public sphere really are, it seems to me, quite irrelevant. Even the call for civility is itself suspect, threatening to obscure the stark clarity of the apocalyptic worldview. Now, of course, what I've drawn is an ideal type. Few men and women outside mental institutions are totally in the grip of the apocalyptic worldview to the exclusion of other influences. And I emphasize again that the subset of American Protestant belief that I've described is strictly that. It's a subset group here. So I'm not painting a broad brush representation of the influence of religion, that great abstraction, on public discourse or civil discourse in our age. But it is a significant segment, continually reinforced by local pastors, televangelists, internet websites, and mass market paperbacks such as the Left Behind series of Tim LaHaye, which has sold, 70 million copies. The numbers blur when you get that high. And I would call your attention to the editorial in the Wall Street Journal this morning by Richard Land, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the Southern Baptist Convention being America's largest Protestant denomination. The theme of the editorial by Mr. Land is summed up in its title, Americans Don't Want a Truce on Social Issues. And he's alarmed that there are some trends in the Republican Party that he sees weakening the culture wars, weakening the struggle between righteousness and evil. And the prophetic belief system that I summarized is pervasive in the Southern Baptist Convention. Opinion polls consistently find something in the area of 30%, excess of 30%, depending on how the question is phrased, of Americans who embrace the apocalyptic worldview that I've just sketched. Despite many predictions that modernity and secularization would proceed hand in hand, religious fundamentalism remains a powerful force in contemporary America. If anything, the communications revolution associated with modernity has amplified and broadened the reach of fundamentalist beliefs. I don't wish to overstate the pervasiveness or influence of these beliefs, but any serious discussion of civility and religion in contemporary American culture must certainly take them into account. Thank you.
Amanda Porterfield is the Robert A. Spivey Professor of Religion and Professor of History at Florida State University. She's a prolific author, has published 7 original monographs, including The Transformation of American Religion, The Story of a Late 20th Century Awakening, and that came out with Oxford in 2001. Her current research addresses the intersection of religion and politics in early America, which will result in the book Early American Doubt, Religion, Politics, and Suspicion, scheduled for publication in 2012 with the University of Chicago Press.
Thank you. It's great to be here with such wonderful friends and colleagues and to meet so many smart, nice, new people, civil people. I agree with everyone that incivility is endemic in American political history, and with Professor Kazin that there have been periods of relative calm, but there have also been obviously periods of huge unrest and violence, the most obvious being the American Civil War. My point today is that religion contributes significantly to American incivility. But I want to start with a few qualifiers. I don't mean to say that religion always does that. Religion does many good things in terms of compassion and outreach and taking care of or reaching out to people who are hurting and abused. I don't mean to say that incivility is always bad. All of the examples this morning in the history panel, especially having to do with civil rights, I'm in total agreement with. But I do think that there is a form of incivility that precludes asking hard questions and having sustained conversations, sustained debate, making decisions about pressing real problems, avoiding disastrous foreign policy and domestic policy. And I think there are forms of incivility that have led to these disasters and failures, and that this is not just what comes along with the territory of democracy. I think that there are some particular things about democracy in America that have to do with religion that have got us to a pass that we are today, and that I think we have been in previous times, where religion is keeping us from asking hard questions and talking about real issues that confront us. As a historian of American religion, I think that there are 2 reasons that religion has been so inflammatory in this way. And if we think about them historically, I think they become more understandable as opposed to throwing up our hands and what can we do about this. The first is that I think that in the Constitution, while there is no reference to God except that the Constitution was written and signed in the year of our Lord, 1787, there is a sense of God hovering around the whole enterprise. And the men who drafted the Constitution, while they disagreed theologically on many different points and had a variety of different religious practices, much narrower than the religious practices in America today, but still disagreements, never entertained the possibility or discussed the possibility that there was not a universal divine governor to the universe around which, or inside of which, whatever was happening in America and the revolutionary new Constitution or this Republican form of government was established. They never anticipated that the U.S. courts would be asked to protect the religious freedom or protect the freedom of people who are non-believers, or that prayer in public schools would be something that would be banned and illegal, or that would even be discussed. People who are religiously conservative understand this, that they are in a world in which a government, there was a past in which God was assumed. God, the universal governor, was just assumed, whatever your different religion was, and that they are now living in a world and in a country where there's a significant minority of unbelievers, and that their constitution is being used to protect those unbelievers from religious discrimination. I think that all of the rhetoric about whether this is a Christian America or not actually obscures this issue for people. The real issue, I think, is God. Now, compounding this problem, so people are very angry. They feel that their country has been invaded by people who don't believe the very foundational cosmology around which the Constitution was structured. And they have a point. Whether it should continue to be that way is something that needs to be discussed, but it never gets discussed because we're always up in flames about whether this is a Christian America or not. Compounding this issue about whether or not there's a metaphysical grounding for the universe is the partisan nature of American politics. The men who wrote the Constitution did not expect there to be a two-party system. They did not expect politics to become the national game, a mass phenomenon in which all kinds of people were engaged. They didn't anticipate the way in which religious invective would be used to fuel partisanship and the partisan divide. On the side of, and of course the parties and the issues change over time, but on the side of people who have held to this more metaphysically grounded notion of America, there is a sense of anger at infidels and atheists, feminists and homosexuals who seem to threaten this, who do threaten, and evolutionary biologists who threaten the very grounds of their understanding of their own personal identity and their understanding of American history. And I think on the other side of people who are religiously liberal and very ecumenical and who want to celebrate religious diversity and religious pluralism, there is a fallacy of what was talked about in the earlier panel of too much civility and extreme niceness. and a kind of naive attitude toward how religion often operates, which is not ecumenically, but is often in ways that are mutually exclusively. Religion is about truth. And I mean, how many truths can you hold simultaneously and not have the one that you think is most important be watered down? So I think these two problems, the metaphysical issue of being now in a nation where there's a significant minority of people who do not believe that there is a divine governor to the universe, and the role of religious invective in partisan debate and the way that props up and electrifies polarization, that these two things make it really difficult for us to have the conversations that we need to have about the hard issues and realities. And I think in terms of solutions, although as a historian I'm not used to doing that, but I'll give one anyway, that a solution is to have us be more educated about how religion mediates people's emotions, people's social place in the world, people's political identity. The more astute we can become through public education or any form of education to be able to think about how religion actually operates and why it's so important to people and what happens when it gets deployed in this way or that way. The more we can be more sophisticated about that, I think the more we can calm down and understand the sources of religious invective and the concern about the lack of metaphysical grounding that so many of our fellow citizens share. Yeah. And I lost my spot.
Next up is Wade Clark Roof. Clark is the J.F. Rowney Professor of Religion and Society and Director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life at the University of California, Santa Barbara. As a graduate of UCSB, I realize that's a difficult place to work, so we feel for you, Clark. He's the author of many books, including Spiritual Marketplace, Baby Boomers, and the Remaking of American Religion, wonderful book that came out in 1999 with Princeton. And he's won just an enormous list of major grants and fellowships for a variety of research projects. He's currently engaged in research on religious pluralism in Southern California.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. The two preceding speakers have set very high standards. I was impressed, Amanda, with you're not looking at your notes, and that sets a high bar for me here. And Paul, all your insightful remarks, and yours were insightful too. But I do need to point out that I'm a sociologist sitting up here in the midst of a bunch of historians. So my language is a little different from theirs, but there's some points of convergence, and I hope we can get at those. I should also note that a sociologist can be kind of peculiar. I have a friend who, historian as you might imagine, a friend who says that a sociologist is somebody who with two children would send one to church and keep the other one at home as a control group to see if it made any difference. And I suppose the difference would be measured by a degree of civility. I don't know. Well, let me say what I want to point out to here is that I think that much of the confusion and disarray that we observe around this issue of civility in relation to religion today is because we haven't looked deeply enough at the nature of the commonality, this was referred to in the earlier panel, or what I'm talking about in my little paper here, social solidarity, that which unites us. So the question is, what is it that unites us in 2011? What is the basis of our commonality or our social solidarity? Now, in this book that was referred to by Paul Boyer, American Grace, the authors Robert Putnam and David Campbell argue that religion in the United States simultaneously and paradoxically divides us and unites us. Now, there's certainly truth in that. It divides us in how we believe, the traditions we hold to, and in the political ideologies to which these religions are associated. Yet at the same time, Americans confront people of different faiths at work, in friendships, and increasingly in marriages, all of which exposes us to many religions, and thus offers a check of sorts on potential divisions. I agree. However, I find that not totally satisfying for what I'm looking for in terms of this quest for the nature of the consensus or the nature of the commonality that we aspire to as Americans. And I want to suggest that the issue of civility and religion is more complex and deeper than any of these surface observations might suggest. My comments are framed then around three interrelated arguments, and I'll try to be relatively brief. The first, as Emile Durkheim would remind us, in addressing civility, we must take seriously the nature of the glue that binds us together. The values and practices of civility are connected in a very deep and intimate way with whatever it is we defined as our commonality. Of course, much of the glue that holds us together today is capitalism and consumption and popular culture and utilitarian individualism. So powerful are these forces, then we confront a problem if we think that religion as conventionally defined is what really unites the country. In an earlier time, we might have said that a Protestant core culture was a strong unifying force, and Christianity, of course, is still influential. But in the contemporary religious diverse context, including a type of diversity in which we now have roughly 17 or 18% of Americans who do not claim a religious affiliation, and that's the highest in polling history in this country, then any argument about national unity as based upon shared religious belief and values is pretty stretched. Now, we've got this big division that has emerged. It's not altogether new, but I think it has intensified in the past 15 or 20 years, and that's the division that has emerged between traditional conservative Christians of the sort that Paul Boyer was talking about, who yearn for a kind of return to a mythical past when we were a Christian country, when we knew or we had more widely shared consensus about religious and moral and ethical issues. And over against that constituency, we've got what's sometimes called progressives or liberals, and all these terms or labels are both helpful and not so helpful, constituted by other groups like Jews and minorities, Muslims, secularists, all the people that Amanda spoke of, liberationists and feminists and homosexuals, you know, all the constituencies that have come onto the map in the public mapping of our diversity, along with many liberal-minded people within Christian groups and other religious groups who are, as we say, more progressively oriented over against the people who would return us to this mythical Christian past. So this latter group does not appeal to the substance of religion as a basis for our unity. It appeals to the governing principles that operate about religion in the country. And those governing principles are religion is a voluntary matter. There is freedom of church and state. Conscience is sacred, if not, or semi-sacred. You can make choices. The substance of religion, thus, is not the basis for the solidarity, but rather the principles that should govern religion in our democratic order. So, drawing off of Charles Taylor, the philosopher who understands Durkheim's work very well, what Charles Taylor has done, which kind of grabs me on this issue, is that he says, if we take Durkheim's notion of solidarity and fine-tune it, that we can put some new labels on our situation here in the United States. The conservative constituency, he says, we might talk about those as neo-Durkheimian, those who could, if we could roll history past and reclaim that mythical past, that would be the basis of the unity. And a lot of the cultural war today is about making sure those earlier Christian principles are maintained, are restored. And the other constituency, the progressive-minded folks, might be talked about as post-Durkheimian, meaning that the consensus to which they seek in the country is not one based upon the substance of religion, but upon, as I said, this freedom to choose a religion and to constitute a social order based upon choice with respect to values and ultimate matters. So we've got a real serious conflict there in what is the nature of the commonality that presumably religious constituencies and increasingly non-religious constituencies appeal to in our common discourse. Now the question is, how does this relate to civility? It seems to me there's an important connection. If we listen to the neo-Durkheimians, the traditionalists, we get an appeal to a civility based upon maintaining order, continuity with the past, holding on to that which has been traditionally defined as good religiously and culturally. This is a point of view which says, in effect, that change is suspicious, that relativism has to be respected, whereas the other group that I'm talking about seeks to hold to a more monolithic conception of order and correctness of belief, and also the values and moral and ethical perspectives that emanate from that. So we've got, at this basis then, quite a difference in how civility is seen. The progressives want a civility that really pushes for justice and equality and recognition of difference, whereas the other group pushes for a civility which will tolerate that only as it has to, but not if it has to give up its core principles based upon substantive faith as defined historically in Christian and apocalyptic terms that Paul Boyer spoke about. Now, the second point, and I'll be briefer, one of the things that is particularly marked in our time is how this fundamental difference in the appeals of these two groups to the nature of civility is tied up with politics. The public arena has been reduced largely to the public. The public arena has been reduced largely to the political. So whether you're on the right or on the left, politics is the means to which to carry on this argument that's going on in our society about the nature, and it bears upon the nature of truth, it bears upon the nature of morality, that which should bind us together as a nation. So the political sphere has been endowed with enormous significance, and that combined with the role that the media plays in our culture today, in the 24-hour cycle of news, picking up on the latest things that have been said in the political arena or in the public arena, all of that now is what shapes us into this culture of it was referred to in the earlier panel, I forget the exact words, but this culture in which we just react to one another. And maybe it was last night with our speaker. We react to what one another says without looking more deeply at the underlying conceptions of the solidarity that we seek to maintain. And the third point related to that is that it seems to me that civility and I agree with all that's been said about the country's got lots of incivility and moments of civility. Civility is often emerges in moments of incivility and new forms of civility. And what the meaning of civility is emerges in historical episodes out of much of the turmoil and clashes that we're describing. So what I see going on today is that we've got a lot of clamoring around what is the nature of our country? Who are we as Americans? And what is it that we share, aside from allegiance to the government? What is it we share? And it seems to me that the civility that we seek can only be possible to the extent that we recognize the differences from which people are coming when they disagree. And only as we learn to put ourselves in the place of the other and seek to understand why he or she argues for that point of view, can we really begin to understand why is it that we ourselves argue as we do? Because none of us are, living on an island alone from one another. We are bound up in a discourse, no matter what our perspective, that is shaped increasingly by our arguments with the other. So can we begin to really appreciate the other as affecting our own arguments? That's basically what I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks. And finally, Kathryn Lofton. Kathryn is an assistant professor of religious studies and American studies at Yale University. Her first book, Oprah, The Gospel of an Icon, was published just this month with UC Press. Essentially what Katie's doing in her work is transforming the way we think about and approach religion in the American context. And she's currently working on a second monograph which examines sexuality within early 20th century Protestant fundamentalism and notions of sexuality, homosexuality, heterosexuality, et cetera.
I want to first of all thank Matt for inviting me and for the Foley Institute and the NEH for their amazing intellectual and organizational labors. I also want to thank in advance Amanda Porterfield, who's going to play a guest starring role in my presentation today. She's going to play the role of a young Kuwaiti woman. So when that comes up, you'll hold your applause to the end, but brace yourself. Historians of American religion like to debate the question of democratization. Has the history of religious formation and reformation in the United States been one of increasing power for the laity? Or is this history tending instead towards centralized structures of Republican authority? It seems impossible to argue the latter, as religions in America have splintered and gathered and splintered under factional protests against wrong scriptural readings, too formal rituals, or megalomaniacal leadership. If the Constitution of the United States sought to foster peaceful revolution through the cyclical electoral process, it perhaps did so better through its disestablishment of religion, thus begetting and begatting denominational difference, discord, and yes, relentless democratization of religion. Here, I refer to democratization as a format, a strategy of including the parishioners in the conceptualization of their parishes. But of course, the democratization of American religion is also something much broader, referring to the way that religions must subordinate themselves to the overarching democratic structures of their occupying nation. Papal authority could no longer save princely malfeasance. Now, church leaders have two courts of accountability, ecclesiastical and secular. And save in rare instances of adjudicated religious freedom, instances that tend toward the protection of individual belief more than social practice, secular formations of democratic authority have dominated. Yet even as I say this, we know that candidates stop on Sunday mornings for pastoral endorsement, as religion seems in a patronizing dance with many aspects of American public life. What I want to talk about today, however, is the way that democratization is increasingly, I think, less a compelling discourse within the broader landscape of American culture. That is to say, I wonder if the public sphere still thinks that practicing democracy matters. This is a very dramatic thing to say in this particular historical moment. And to argue it, I want to take a roundabout route through an example that is to me broadly indicative, that of, yes, Miss Oprah Winfrey. In an episode that aired in October of 2004, Winfrey and her producers tracked women at 30 around the world. I want to thank a grad student at Yale, Amina El-Anan, for reminding me of this wonderful episode. In this episode, we track thin waists of French women and the new wealth of Russian women. Oprah's reporters breathlessly offer a global portrait of girl-to-girl confessions about variable female physicality and acquisitive possibility that has become her particular brand of collaborative comparison. For the purposes of our discussion today, however, one dialogue stands out. Oprah introduces us to Zain, a woman she describes as a typical Kuwaiti woman. Typical because, like all Kuwaiti women, she says, she has a stylish flair and spares no expense when it comes to fashion. Lest you think this is merely the Miami of Arabia, Winfrey quickly turns our attention to serious admirations. To Kuwait University, where everyone goes for free and women outnumber men. To Kuwaiti women working, Kuwaiti women never paying taxes because nobody does. And to the various gifts of the Kuwaiti government, including that free education, free medical care, and cash wedding gifts from the emir. The montage shows beautiful Kuwaiti women lounging with books in decadent circumstances, laughing in boisterous groups with other women, and being served food by their princely-looking husbands. In short, it seems that in Kuwait, women are still princesses. Oprah prompts a reality check, saying in her voiceover, "Unlike the United States, there are freedoms Kuwaiti women do not enjoy. Though it is one of the few democracies in the Middle East, women have never been able to vote." I note that now Kuwaiti women do have the right to vote. I'll proceed with the discussion, though, to show how its politics still persist. Their discussion then goes back to the studio, and this is what brings our guest star in. Oprah. Wow, so you buy anything you want to buy. You can go down the street, you have all the freedoms. Okay, but you can't vote.
We can't vote.
You can't vote? Do women work? I mean, I don't see it. You can't vote?
We can't vote.
The audience laughs as this beautiful Oprah interlocutor seems not at all lacking for agency, for freedom, for all the things a girl could want. Oprah continues. Okay, Zain says all her friends fly to Paris and Milan to get their wedding dresses. Really?
Yes, a very good percentage of my friends do that. I don't want to apologize for the fact that we were born into this lifestyle. We were born into this lifestyle. Not all people fly to Europe to get their wedding dresses, but really the accessibility it's just better from Kuwait. And again, you don't have to worry about your college education, so why not spend that money on your daughter's wedding gown?
Yeah, okay. And so as a woman, do women feel oppressed at all because they can't vote and they don't have certain rights?
Oh, no, not at all.
No, women do not feel oppressed.
We do not because
Because you're too busy shopping.
Right.
Yeah. Oprah concludes, you don't feel oppressed at all, right? You're too busy buying Prada. On the one hand, we could see Oprah here as fighting on behalf of democracy, pressing her subject, her object, to confess. It's sort of awful not to have the vote, right? But because her subject is not ostensibly unhappy, because Oprah and her producers have found a very Oprah kind of Kuwaiti woman, the talk of democracy is really secondary to the better forms of freedom, the more meaningful acts of female freedom, voting, schmoting. These women have husbands who love them and jobs that put more money in their pockets. You harried women could learn a thing or two from their gorgeous ease. Purchasing objects thus becomes third wave feminist practice. Oprah's encouraged practices of consumption are not only intended to improve an aesthetic or perfect a social position, but are also a means to change the experience of living for her viewers, be it its own practice of democracy, wherein your contributions to these economies' exchange are their own form of activism. The practice of buying feeds internal and external change for such women, dressing and surrounding them with the material beauty that should be reflected, Oprah argues, in their spiritual interior. In Winfrey's idiom, the difference between habitual consumption and identification of products with something else is the difference between those two gerunds, buying and shopping. If buying is to gain possession of something by giving it an equivalent value, shopping is, in Oprah's world, a good thing. It is, she says, a way of examining the world. If variety, she continues, is the spice of life, shopping provides it. The best kind of shopping is as delicious and satisfying as love. And like love, it has less to do with having and accumulating than with thoughtful appreciation and delight. Again, Oprah recasts the process of consumption as a moral imperative. Shopping provides it. And an emotional expenditure, like love. Women are told to buy and save, accessorize and restrain. They are told that their purchasing power is correlated to their moral merit. Individual shopping choices offer moments of possible piety. Anyone who consumes the Winfrey empire knows this then. They know that the thing is the thing beyond all ideas, all structures, all governments, all principles. The commodity deserves sacred regard because of her divine care and its nomination for you, and because of her divine certitude that through the abundance of her gifts, the world will see reminders of their worthiness. Describing one group of gift recipients, Winfrey says, "The joy wasn't about the toys. It was the feeling, somebody thought of me. I matter. I wasn't forgotten. The gift now is no longer a gift. It's a conveyance of being seen. Giving gifts does something that casting votes just can't capture." This prescriptive practice reverberates throughout her empire. In the O magazine, the O list produces an O aesthetic that exhibits monthly products Winfrey purportedly thinks are just great. Such style exclusives mirror descriptions deployed by all style magazines, yet Oprah differentiates herself by the emphasis of the potential consequence of their purchase. For an article emphasizing the sartorial benefits of global sensibilities, she explains that places that know the meaning of heat, like Africa, India, Turley, Mexico, also possess the secret of dressing for it. There is no doubt that going global is the thing to do, to buy, to wear, to be. The magazine and the show encourage minor activist missions for the busiest schedules, tasks that introduce you to your locality. She writes, "Our simplest shopping decisions can protect the environment, save family farms, lift villages from destitution, and restore dignity to war-torn communities. Not just thousands of miles away," the article continues, "but also at home." Consider here how in this language, the practice of purchase connects to the texting for charities and charitainment that comprises so much of our discussions of political engagement in the contemporary public sphere. The O version of these features is coded into a geopolitical complexity and female anxiety with a very explicit orgiastic glee. The making of that good buy, how it is done, and for whom, is complicit in any description of the making of the American secular and the spiritual ambition that enfolds it. Whatever neoliberalism is or isn't, whatever postmodernity has or has not provided, whatever capitalism will or will not become, we have to agree that one of the great success stories of the last 30 years, Oprah's years, has been the complete conversion, the conversion of a nation, to consumption as the adjudicating determinant of our relative freedom. Our ideas of democracy, our ideas of religion, have become inextricable from our ideas of consumer practice. The relationship between Oprah Winfrey and Barack Obama is not then only the relationship between plug and product, between the endorser and the endorsed. It is more. It is the correlation between two products that format themselves in strikingly similar ways. The endorsement of Obama by Oprah against all Nielsen tugs proved again that the product was not the manipulation of market researchers, but hers and hers alone. Obama became, like the items distributed in her favorite things bonanzas, another thing that Oprah thought was just great. That greatness has no podiums or positions. Like a purse, an ice cream flavor, or a book club selection, Oprah's presidential nominee was an extension of the partiality she shares as her brand. It has turned out that, as with almost everything else, her taste was her nation's preference, and he won. This process of recasting candidate into product isn't anything new. However, that process of a corporate entity spiritualizing the meaning of that product and the meaning of that purchase has profound consequences for our conceptualizations of democratic practice and democratic choice and our political, economic, and religious futures to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I should add, I meant to say this when I introduced everybody, but that I was able to help put together this panel, and I chose these folks because they're brilliant scholars, but also because they're wonderful mentors and teachers and colleagues, and they very much embody the civility that I think we're trying to talk about today. I have a number of questions, but I want to open things up to the rest of the group, but I'll just ask one and see how things go. But that is, the earlier panel, the history panel, talked about the benefits of the civil rights movement and incivility. And yet, in a number of these papers, I've heard some concern and some caution about the incivility of what we could call the religious right. When do we know the difference between good incivility and bad incivility?
I think that's for Paul or Matt.
Well, I would echo Michael Kazin's. It all depends on context. This theme has come up and woven into our panels in fascinating ways, and it's so basic. How high a priority do we place on civility, and what do we mean by civility? Last night, there was a mention of the demonstrations in Madison and posters comparing Governor Scott Walker to Hitler, and I guess I saw one of those with a little mustache, but they were not by any means the dominant theme of the protests. There was a lot of humor, a lot of Scott toilet paper being carried around, and with the slogan being "He's good for something," or "It's Scott is good for something," at least. But well, that's an aside. Sorry, but the point is, who is being civil and incivil in that particular immediate parochial moment in Wisconsin? The governor who refuses to compromise and who even seems to refuse to acknowledge his opponents as human fellow citizens of Wisconsin, let alone fellow human beings, or the demonstrators in all their raucous, vulgar Wisconsin humor. I think civility is, what does the word mean? It means creating conditions of a civil order. And it doesn't have to do with niceness exactly. It has to do with a kind of higher level of political perceptions. And in that, to get back to the question that we were posed here, I think civility is certainly a value, and a very, very high value in that sense as I just described it. But as Stephen Carter said last night, perhaps there are moments when it is not the highest value, and we heard about those in the first panel this morning. What seems to me to be happening in contemporary culture, and particularly the religious culture that I've been looking at, is everything becomes so vital and so fundamental from the point of view of the person or governor or whoever it may be, that all political discourse is superior to these goals of civility. So in the past, we had urgent moral moments in our history, the abolitionist movement, perhaps for others the Vietnam War, or certainly for many the civil rights movement, where this was so fundamental that it transcended the goals of a common discourse. Today, when issues over balancing the budget become so fundamental that they seem to transcend civility and civic discourse, it seems to me we have moved in some kind of pretty dramatic way in our public culture that we're only beginning to come to terms with.
I would just quickly add that if the real issue is how do we get down to real problems that we have that we're not making any headway on about, well, we made some headway on healthcare, foreign policy, things that we just are having such trouble talking about. When incivility is bad, when it keeps us from that hard discussion. Incivility is good when it says, come on, get rid of this stuff that's in the way of that and protests what keeps us from having those discussions.
I would echo that last line, that incivility is very good when it somehow pushes the boundaries of civil discourse, paradoxically, because it forces us to rethink what is taken as conventional boundaries, conventional definitions, pushes us beyond the niceness thing to dig deeper into what it is that we are as a people and what are the values that unite us or about which, and maybe we shouldn't overstate this uniting thing, but the values that push us to serious debate about the kind of country, the kind of place we want this to be.
With that, I think we should take some questions from the audience. Once again, I'll ask you to be brief, please, and also introduce yourself. And come on up.
My name is Jack Nisbet. I'm a writer and historian from Spokane. And I'm not desperately, but I'm looking for some context to the Supreme Court decision this week about the Kansas church who visited North Idaho and Spokane a couple months ago and seemed so wildly peripheral that it made no sense. But am I missing something? Is there, I mean, they're certainly the most uncivil thing we've talked about all day. Is there something more to them that I don't understand?
Well, the issue of the decision, there was only one dissenter, Scalia. Everybody else agreed that Fred Phelps and Alito, thank you. Alito was the one dissenter. That freedom of speech really trumps everything. And, you know, maybe that religious invective here has to be reframed in terms of political categories. And just not, the court just not being willing to prohibit anyone's free speech, no matter how vitriolic. Could you state your question again? Yeah.
Is there something they're doing that's pushing it in the direction Mr. Roof was just talking about that's going to do somebody some good on some level in the long run that I don't see?
I would, in addition to the constitutional First Amendment issue that Amanda reported, in terms of American religious life, these folks at the Kansas City church are, as I view it, at one far extreme of what is in fact a very widespread perception in elements of American evangelical religion at the moment, that America is has moved from a position of divine favor, as Amanda described in her presentation, to a society that in fact has gone over to the dark side. And from an apocalyptic perception, apocalyptic worldview, America is becoming part of the Antichrist system. So when Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, after the 9/11 attack, agreed that this was a form of divine punishment for American wickedness, that was another expression of that very, very extreme view that religious truth transcends the conventions of human sympathy for suffering victims. It transcends normal patriotism. It transcends what we think of as the normal conventions of civil society, that you don't go to the funeral of a dead soldier and wave signs that God hates America. Now, admittedly, that's an extremely far out position at the very end of the spectrum, so I don't want to appear to be painting all of fundamentalist Christians in America with this brush of extreme polarizing of all reality, but it is part of a recognizable pattern that that is very pervasive in American life, and these folks have just taken it to the kind of ultimate level.
I'm Josh Cohen from Stanford, and I have 3 observations, each of which is designed to draw out some complexity in the relationship between religion and civility, which you've gestured at in some ways, but I'd like to hear more about. So the first 2 come from the Putnam-Campbell book. So Wade, you observed that Putnam points out 17% of Americans now belong to no church. They identify with no church. Not that they're atheists, they identify with no church. The more striking fact is that that's true about 25% of younger Americans. Right. They are, as Putnam calls them, the new nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. And the story that Putnam tells about them is that the reason that that group has grown so fast is as a reaction to the kind of religious fundamentalism that you were describing, Paul. So maybe he's right and maybe he's wrong on the numbers. Let's say he's right. That suggests that in thinking about the relationship between religion and civility, particularly the kind of religious fundamentalist-driven incivility that you were describing, Paul, that a complexity in that relationship may be that fundamentalist-driven incivility actually has the happy reaction, I think it's fair to say happy reaction, of producing a greater commitment to civility elsewhere in the population. Mm-hmm. That's observation number 1. Second observation, also from Putnam, which goes to the issue of different dimensions of civility. So Putnam claims, controversially, but again, maybe stipulate for the sake of argument, that on some dimensions of civility, regular churchgoers look very good. So in particular on generosity and giving and on civic engagement, that is participation in ordinary acts of community engagement and political engagement. On toleration, regular churchgoers look less good. The intolerance is directed particularly toward, unsurprisingly, Muslims, a little more surprisingly Mormons, and still more surprisingly Buddhists. They seem to be the 3 groups who whatever. Anyway, so so there are different dimensions of civility. The civic participation side, the effect looks positive. The toleration side, which is what a bunch of our conversation is about, the effect looks negative. So reflection on that. Third, there's a lot of conversation here about Protestant fundamentalism. In an earlier generation, the concerns were about Catholic fundamentalism. So Father Leonard Feeney was excommunicated from the Catholic Church in the early 1950s because he refused to come to Rome to answer charges of endorsing a heretical view of the doctrine that outside the Church there's no salvation. Father Feeney used to make incredibly vicious anti-Semitic speeches on the Boston Common in the early 1950s. Mel Gibson's father is a Feeneyite, as is Mel Gibson. The interesting fact that makes the story about Feeney more complicated, though, is how Feeney came to the view that that there was a decline in American Catholicism, and that the decline could be attributed to the rejection of an orthodox interpretation that outside the Church there's no salvation. And the way he came to this view was by reflecting on the failure of American Catholics to respond in opposition to the use of nuclear weapons to end World War II. The complexity in the story here is somebody who's being, on many of the conventional dimensions of civility that we're discussing, particularly the toleration dimension, about as bad as you can get. But on another dimension of civic contribution, namely putting a moral topic on the table that generally people aren't raising, it looks like there was an important contribution, and arguably, it's like the second Great Awakening abolitionists, arguably there's a relationship between the two. It was the strength of the Orthodox convictions, the unrelenting strength of the Orthodox convictions that enabled him to push hard. He got distracted by his towards anti-Semitism, but to push hard on a moral issue and to raise a moral challenge that other people weren't raising. So does incivility have this, religiously inspired incivility have the effect of producing civility? That's a cheerful story. Different dimensions of civility, toleration being one, civic participation being another, the effects may be different. And is there a benefit to the most extreme forms of incivility, namely putting moral topics on the table that other people are just in the spirit of going along to get along, not raising?
I tend to agree with all three of your points, but particularly with point one and point two. I think yesterday and this morning and now we've confronted, at least raised the issue that civility and incivility is a kind of a strange relationship between these two. It's not an easy way to formulate, and therefore when we talk about civility versus incivility, we have to be careful that we don't fall off into abstractions on either side, because these two are complexly related, and what looks like civility may have incivil consequences, and what looks like incivility may have civil consequences. And the second point I think is terribly important. Back to, again, to abstractions. It's a problem with labels. It's a problem with how we define civility or incivility. There are dimensions of these things, because we're looking at the way in which human beings express their civility or their incivility, or our civility and our incivility. We are part of this ourselves. So we have to look at how that changes over time. What would be, if you said, what comes to your mind? I sometimes do this in class when I'm, not particularly on this topic, but on various kinds of topics. Or I say religion at UCSB, what comes to your mind? And ultimately I get these weird comments like, well, we got Buddhists and we got Jews and we got Christians and we got Catholics. I say, what? We have Christians and we have Catholics, as if they haven't thought through their typologies very well, because Christian the term has been hijacked for the evangelicals, and they don't know the history well enough to know that Catholics are Christians too. So if we say civility or incivility, what comes to our mind as a good act that describes either of those, or a good act in the sense that it fills the role of a definition? Well, the point is our imaginations about these terms vary over time. The way in which these words get used, the labels, again, the role of the media comes into play here, how they define what is a civil or an incivil act. So it becomes very complicated. But I appreciate your point about the dimensions.
I was going to say two things. One, I'm really unconvinced of anything that would try to argue that statistic about youth disavowal of church membership has much to do with reacting to images or iconography of fundamentalist politics. And I think any of us can just think through our classrooms and their knowledge of fundamentalist intervention in public politics, and that's an unlikely reason why youth today are not participating in churches. And we can postulate more as to why, but I don't think it's a reaction to an image of conservative belief. And second, I think what's worth noting too is though we get captured by it because the media formats it for our pleasure, public acts of the so-called Christian rights political intervention. I feel like I've learned from scholarship by Matt, by Darren Dochuk, that the most successful acts of political intervention by that so-called Christian right have not been public demonstrations, have not been mass social movements, but have been permeating acts of much more privatizing intervention at the level of paper distribution, local public schools, acts of intervention that are much more privatized and less displays in front of abortion clinics. So I think our image of what the Christian right is as a public politic of incivility is disproportionate to actually where and when it's been politically successful.
Which adds to the complexity issue that we're trying to work on. When is something uncivil, when it may be less uncivil than we think, or in ways that are different from the ways that we think?
Hello, my name is Chris Schlecht, and I teach at New St. Andrews College and at Washington State, and the most important credential is that I'm one of Matt's students, so you can understand me and where I'm coming from and whatever that might represent. But I have a couple of questions about fundamentalism, which is what I study. My first question is perhaps directed to Professor Boyer, maybe perhaps both of them are, but is when we talk about civility, is civility an idea or is it an action? When we talk about incivility, are we talking about uncivil doctrines or are we talking about uncivil performances or actions in the public square? Okay, so the first is definitional, and perhaps it's both. And the second is, in the discussions of fundamentalism, the presence of fundamentalists is offered as sort of a problem or something that needs to be worked through in a discussion of civility. Professor Boyer, I wrote down something that resonates with me, and I can envision myself sitting in your chair saying something similar, but that they produce a theologically derived discourse and not amenable to debate. Someone who would identify themselves from your description then would hear you say that and would feel marginalized by a remark like that. And I say this not in order to, I'm being pointed in one sense, but in another sense I'm inviting myself into your chair too, to sort of work through this here. And that is that to what extent is even this discussion of civility produce a problem of marginalizing? And maybe I can give another example apart from the words spoken here. That when I pass through my academic building at Washington State University, I pass a sign that says on a door, no racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic language allowed here. Okay, which is deliberately exclusionary. And I'm just curious about how to reflect, how we might reflect upon that. There you go.
Well, is civility a matter of belief or incivility, or civility being, are they matters of belief and attitudes, or are they matters of action? You can't draw a sharp distinction because there is a flow back and forth. And one of the things I tried to get across in my talk was I see civility in a different context than sort of individual behavior toward other people, and even in a different context from individual belief to a social phenomenon, a structural phenomenon. I think there can be structural components built into the social and economic order that are inherently uncivil in the sense that they diminish a sense of common purpose and a sense of a common civic society. And this can be a tax structure that inhibits a sense of a common society, that is not an individual person going to some other individual person and behaving in an uncivil way, or even a group behaving in an uncivil way. But the end product of structural incivility can create the conditions of an uncivil society. You really make an interesting point about that's talking about fundamentalist belief or a subset even of Bible prophecy believers, as I did this morning, marginalize and distance myself from that group. And it's a very, I think it's an issue that we really need to think about very seriously. It's so easy to fall into the language of othering, to use a contemporary term. And academics may be particularly vulnerable to it because that's our business. You know, we sort of abstract from the specific and the detailed to the general level, but we're talking about real people, and we're talking about our neighbors and our relatives in many cases. And all I can say is I think there's a middle way between simply being agreeable to everyone we meet because we want to be nice to them and we don't want to create conflict on one hand, and thinking critically about our society and what various positions that groups take, what the implications of those positions are for our common society. And when I find myself in conversation with a prophecy believer or a fundamentalist believer, whether it's an airplane seatmate or, we all have these encounters, I often find that I can find a small bit, sometimes a small bit, but a bit of common ground where I think, yeah, I can agree with you on that. It's within a larger framework of kind of radical disagreement, but if you can kind of build on that little seed of commonality, one thing is recognizing the authenticity of often the emotions or feelings from which a political or social position arises, and acknowledging that living in a moment of radical change and globalization and rising secularism, whatever these components are, is unsettling and is frightening and scary, and to recognize the even if I don't agree with the end position, if it's a nostalgic turning back to an imagined past, we can recognize the emotion or the feelings from which that position comes and honor it even.
I would just add one thing, which I think that it's important. I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but if there could be some kind of really serious public discussion about the existence of God. Because I think that that is at the core of the conservative concern about America, and it has become politicized. And in the politicizing of that gets us away from having a serious public discussion about that. And it's connected to all kinds of things associated with science, public schooling. There's almost no issue that it doesn't touch, and we can thank conservatives for pointing that out. But we haven't yet had an open conversation about that. It would be great if the president had a conversation about that and invited people to discuss this and why people think that there's a governor of the universe and why people think there's not, and what it means for America for those two different points of view.
Michael Kazin. Just a comment on that. I don't think Obama's going to make that a centerpiece for his 2012 campaign.
It's a great thought experiment.
Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah. It'd be a great novel anyway. But I want to raise a rather big question. It's kind of late, but it's one that is on my mind as I was listening to these fascinating talks, especially Amanda and Paul, a little less Wade, not Kathryn at all, really. I learned a lot from what you said and agree with a lot of it, but underneath some of it was, I think, an implication that the culture war is still raging, much as it has been since the 1960s on some of these questions. I'm not sure about that, I mean, very quickly, take homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage. More and more, if you look at headlines, you look at what people who are thinking about running for president on the Republican Party are saying, except when they're in Iowa. There's a sense that this is the train has left the station. The fact that Obama was able, the Justice Department said we're not going to defend DOMA anymore, and has there been a huge outcry? Maybe Sarah Palin's Facebook. I haven't seen it recently, but but I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be a big issue. Some people say, well, that's because of the economic crisis, but I think it's beyond that. I think that the culture wars in our history and most, histories of most countries don't last forever, and people have moved on, and the fact that young people, as was mentioned, I mean, students at a place like where I teach, are not typical of students, here or anyplace else, but certainly anybody who calls himself a Christian, immediately the thought is, do you hate gay people? and they have to say, no, no, don't worry, I don't hate gay people. I'm still a Christian, you know. And that's, abortion's more complicated. And also, look at what happened with the Cordoba Center, you know, the Islamic Center, that huge furor for a while, but now it's going away, you know. What happened to it? Similar with the guy who wanted to burn the Quran. So it seems like, in fact, Richard Land, I haven't read the column today, that seems like a plea. Don't forget us, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
He's losing his audience. So
Yeah.
I'm not saying we've become a very civil country about all these issues. I just think that perhaps people who believe the kind of thing that Paul's talking about, as he said, they're not just a minority, they're an embattled minority, I think, especially the implications of that. You know, people don't take the Westboro people at all seriously. You know, maybe there's a small group that do, but most Americans probably look at that, I would guess, that decision and said, okay, you want to let, if crazy kooks want to offend people, let crazy kooks offend people. You know, what the hell? And so I just wonder, just to pose the question to all of you, you know, have we turned a page in terms of the culture war in this country? Are our battles now, more importantly, over the size of government as opposed to whether gay people can get married?
Yeah, well, that's great. I think you're right. I think there is a symbiotic relationship here between what is perceived as an upsurge, turning a page, and then a subgroup that is more and more angry about that. And Richard Land's column, yes, it's a sense of a plea for what he sees as maybe at the moment a diminished attention to the culture wars, but he speaks for a powerful major Protestant denomination in America. And who would have predicted in 1950 the resurgence of evangelical fundamentalist religion and the political mobilization of that occurred in the 70s, 80s, and in many ways still survives. So I agree with you. Yes, it's a fluid situation. In some ways, if you look at certain issues, you can see the more conservative fundamentalist positions eroding, but I would caution against what used to call a Whiggish view of history, of sort of it's people move on, things are ultimately getting better and better, and yes, there are interim periods of setbacks, and the culture wars sort of get intense for a while, but the ultimate trajectory is for the good. I hope that's true. But as historians, we have to be aware that there's not a single line trajectory in one direction or another.
They're getting better. I just think the issues that people divide on have changed.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Well, the bill that's about to pass in Wisconsin, called a budget repair bill, includes as one of its provisions removing the provision of birth control as a Medicare benefit or Medicaid benefit, not abortion, birth control. Mm-hmm. I mean, if any issue seemed to be settled, it's that birth control is acceptable. But here we are. If this bill passes into law, it will be the law in the state of Wisconsin. So it's a complicated story.
I would add to that I think it's very much a mixed picture. You raise a very interesting question, but I think my sense of the polling data of the last 6 to 8 years suggests that there has been a shift in views about gay marriage, particularly among under 40 age Americans. However, for that same constituency, there has not been a shift in views toward abortion. So that the abortion issue continues, and that means it has been a big issue now for quite a long time, whereas, and this is back to the fact, it depends on what issue you're looking at on which we make a generalization. I do agree with you that the issues shift, but the abortion issue, and now throw back to birth control of all things, that one seems to be, well, it has sticking power. It's staying on with us. Whereas there is this liberation of views on gay marriage that's occurring. So, no, the culture wars are not over, but they change.
Well, I won't ask Cornell if I have permission to comment as well in my role as chair, but I'm going to comment without asking permission. But your sense that they're not an embattled minority, I wonder if that's because they've actually won many of these debates. The fact that we're talking about gay marriage, that wasn't something gays and lesbians were talking about in the 1970s. Marriage was the traditional heterosexual Christian institution. And now the religious right has so defined the terms of the debates that now that's what gays and lesbians aspire to is marriage. Same thing with abortion. I mean, nobody in the federal government stands up and asks for increased funding for abortion and part of health care for abortion rights. I mean, they don't want to overturn Roe v. Wade, but that's as far as they will go. So I'm apparently more pessimistic than you are on where we're going. But any final thoughts?
Just one last thought. I think that how we define religion in relationship to politics is really key. And I would say that we should always keep that boundary fluid. And that there's a way in which the Tea Party, for example, is in many cases very political rather than religious in some previous notion of religion or some mainline notion of religion. But in fact, Jeffersonian laissez-faire individualism is operating like a religion for the Tea Party. So we do ourselves a disservice in not thinking about that political, largely political movement as really also a religious movement over a religious sacred notion of America.
I agree.
We are out of time. We reconvene at 1 o'clock? 1 o'clock. Lunch is in the atrium. Everybody is invited, so just be out the door and I believe to the left.
Fascinating stuff, huh?
Thank you. And you did very well. You have a great future. Soap opera.